The road curved along the cliffside like a slow exhale, and the sea below shimmered with a kind of indifference that made me uneasy. Amir drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting casually on my knee. A practice gesture, one he'd probably rehearsed in his head to look natural. I smiled, because that's what good wives do when husbands are trying. The house appeared just as the GPS voice fell silent, a pale structure against the horizon, edges softened by salt and wind. "Peace by the sea," he murmured. The phrase he'd used in every therapy session when he swore things would change. His tone was tender, but I could hear the steel beneath it, the quiet expectation that I'd play along. Inside the car, the air smelled of new leather and old tension. I watched him glance at the rearview mirror too often, as though he expected something, or someone, to be following. "You're quiet," he said finally. "I'm just tired," I answered, though what I meant was afraid of what peace will cost me this time. He reached over, squeezing my hand. "Let's start over, Mariam. No more ghosts, ghosts." He said it softly, but the word lingered. I looked out the window, the ocean stretching endlessly, the gulls circling above like pale warnings. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this trip wasn't another performance stitched together with apologies and half-truths. When we reached the house, he smiled too widely. "Perfect, isn't it?" The house loomed ahead, white walls, shuttered windows, the faint creak of something unseen inside. I nodded, pretending to see beauty instead of emptiness. In my mind, I repeated his promise, peace by the sea. But as the waves crashed somewhere beyond the dunes, another thought whispered back, colder, truer. Sometimes when he says peace, he really means silence, and in that silence, I already felt the beginning of something ending. The first night, the house spoke in its own language, sighs through the floorboards, murmurs in the walls, water whispering through pipes like gossip. I told myself it was just old construction meeting ocean air, but the sound had rhythm, intent, as if the place remembered. Amir carried our bags inside and opened the windows, letting in a draft that smelled of brine and rust. "Hear that?" he said lightly. Just the sea breathing, but it wasn't the sea. The sounds came from within, footsteps soft and deliberate far down the hall. When I mentioned it, he laughed. "You're letting your imagination win again." His voice had that careful patience therapists love to praise. He'd learned to sound gentle, even when he was dismissing me. Later, while he unpacked, I wandered into the main room. Dust floated in the air like ghosts deciding whether to stay. The shelves were empty except for a chipped mug and an old photograph face down behind it. I turned it over. Two silhouettes standing at the same shoreline just beyond our window. The woman's hair whipped across her face, but the man's posture, it was unmistakably his. My throat tightened. "Amir," I called. "Did you—" He appeared too quickly, taking the photo from my hand. "Probably the previous owners," he said, sliding it into his pocket with an easy smile. "This house has had lives before us." That night, the wind pressed against the windows like a plea. I lay awake, listening. Somewhere above, a door creaked open and shut on its own. Then, faint, almost tender, a woman's laughter echoed down the hall. I sat up. "Amir," he was already asleep beside me, or pretending to be. The sound faded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to ask the right question. When dawn came, light spilled across the floor like a confession, revealing footprints in the fine dust near the door. One pair larger, one smaller, neither mine. I looked at him, still sleeping, and thought, he's been here before, and the house knew it. The morning light came pale and tired through the salt-fogged window. Amir was outside, pretending to fix the lock on the gate, his sleeves rolled up like a man trying to prove usefulness. I unpacked our things, folding his shirts with mechanical precision, the sound of gulls outside like mocking laughter. The drawers smelled faintly of rose and damp wood, an odd mix for a house abandoned for years. I opened the top one, expecting dust, and found instead a photograph tucked beneath a cracked leather notebook. Amir's face stared back at me. Younger, lighter, his arm around a woman I didn't recognize, at least not fully. Her smile was bright, free. But someone had taken a pen and drawn a single jagged line through her face, ink carved deep enough to tear the paper. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My fingers trembled, tracing the torn edge of her smile. Behind them, the house, this house, stood exactly as it did now, same curtain, same pale blue door. The drawer creaked as I closed it. Too loud. His footsteps followed immediately, heavy and deliberate. What did you find? His tone was casual, but the quickness in his voice betrayed something raw. I held the photo up between us. Who is she? He barely glanced at it. Must have been the owners. You know how these rentals are. People leave junk behind. His words were smooth, but his hands betrayed him. They tightened at his sides, knuckles whitening. Then why was her face crossed out? I whispered. He forced a smile, the one that used to calm me. You're reading too much into it again. You always do this. There it was in the shift. The soft cruelty dressed as reason. The same tone he used in therapy when he'd say we just misunderstand each other. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But as he brushed past me to close the drawer himself, I noticed his hand linger on the wood too long, like a man revisiting something buried. When he turned away, I saw it, a flicker of guilt or maybe remembrance, passing across his face like a cloud over water. That night, I dreamed of the woman in the photograph. She was standing at the shore calling my name. The days began to stretch like shadows at dusk, long, thin, and uneasy. Amir had grown quieter since the photograph. He smiled more often now, but the smiles didn't reach his eyes. Every morning he disappeared down the beach for hours, claiming he needed air or time to think. I stayed behind pretending to read, pretending not to notice how the sea had started to sound like breathing through the walls. The silence of the house pressed in on me until I finally couldn't stand it anymore. One gray afternoon, when the tide was low and the air smelled of storm, I followed him. My sandals sank into wet sand as I walked far enough to see his figure in the distance, a solitary shadow bent over the earth. He was digging, not idly but with purpose. His movements were sharp, desperate. I ducked behind a dune, the wind catching fragments of his muttering. He lifted something from the pit, I couldn't see what, then stared at it for a long, frozen moment before covering it again. His hands lingered in the sand as if saying goodbye. When he stood, his shoulders seemed heavier. He turned back toward the house, and I barely made it inside before he entered. Forced a smile. Walk help? I asked, my voice small. He looked at me for a heartbeat too long before answering. It did. Later, when he reached for his glass of water, I caught the scent. Faint but undeniable. Metal. Cold. Clean. Like blood rinsed in seawater. What did you touch out there? I asked softly. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. Just the past, he said. Then almost gently, some things should stay buried. The words lodged deep in me. That night I lay awake, the sound of waves pounding like footsteps against the shore. I imagined him outside again, digging under the moon, the metal scent mixing with salt. Sleep didn't come. Only the steady hum of the ocean and the whisper of sand shifting beneath something hidden. By dawn, I knew I would have to find out what he'd buried, even if it meant unearthing more than I could bear. It began with a vibration, faint, almost innocent, as Amir stepped out for his morning walk. I ignored it at first, thinking it was just the wind rattling the window. But when I looked down, my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. You're not the first, just 4 words, cold, precise. I stared at them until the text blurred. My throat went dry. I waited for another, maybe an explanation, a joke, something, but nothing came. By the time Amir returned, I'd deleted it, though the imprint of those words seemed to pulse behind my eyes. That evening, it happened again. He went to shower and the phone buzzed. You should leave before the tide does what he did. I dropped the phone. The message vanished, replaced by the screen's reflection. My own face, pale and trembling, staring back at me like a stranger. When Amir came out, wrapped in steam and calmness, I tried to study him. Did anyone call for you? I asked lightly. He frowned. Why would they? Just asking. He smiled, slow and practiced. You're imagining things again. The word stung again. Always again. Like every fear of mine was a trick my mind invented. But that night when I went to bed, there was something waiting on my pillow. A small seashell, pearly white, damp as if freshly plucked from the shore. I didn't scream. I just stared at it. Because earlier that morning I had seen Amir's shoes by the door, wet, caked with sand. Was this his warning? His game? Or had someone else been inside the house while I slept? I barely closed my eyes all night. Every creak in the wood felt like a footstep. Every sigh of the ocean like a whisper. When dawn finally came, the shell was still there. Dry now, hollow. I placed it in the drawer beside the bed, beside the photograph I'd found earlier. For the first time, I noticed something I'd missed before. The woman in the picture was wearing a shell necklace, and suddenly, I knew this wasn't a message from the sea. It was from her. The storm began before the thunder. A silence too heavy to breathe in. The air pressed against the windows, thick with waiting. I stood in the living room, the shell in my palm, the photograph beside it, and my voice trembling as I asked, "Who was she, Amir?" He didn't look up from his drink. The ice clinked softly, a cruel rhythm. "Don't start. I found her picture. I found her necklace. How long were you planning to pretend this place was new for us?" He set the glass down. The wind outside howled, shaking the window panes. "You shouldn't have looked." The words cracked through me like lightning. "You brought me here to erase her, didn't you?" I said, my breath shallow. "To prove you could rewrite the ending." For a heartbeat, he said nothing. Then softly, too softly, he whispered, "You were never supposed to find her." Something shattered inside me. The room tilted with the force of my heartbeat. "So she was real," I said. "And she's the one buried out there?" Amir's face changed. Not guilt, not fear, but something darker. An exhausted rage that no longer needed to hide. "You don't understand what this place does. What she did." He moved toward me fast, too fast. I stepped back, my hand brushing the table. The glass he'd left behind toppled, shattering against the floor. The storm outside roared to life. Rain hammering the roof, the lights flickering in bursts. He stood inches from me, breathing hard, his voice a low growl. "You wanted the truth? You wouldn't survive it." And then, without warning, he turned away. He grabbed his coat and keys, the front door bursting open with the wind. "Amir!" I shouted, my voice drowned by the storm. He didn't turn back, just walked into the night, rain swallowing him whole. The house groaned in his absence, every sound like a scream pressed between its walls. I stood there, soaked and shaking, watching the sea through the window. The waves rising higher, angrier. Something out there was calling him. Or maybe warning me. Either way, the storm wasn't done. The storm had passed, but the world felt newly broken. The air hung heavy with the scent of wet earth and salt, and the waves still hissed like something half alive. I woke to find his side of the bed cold, his coat gone, his shoes gone. The front door left open, banging softly in the wind. Outside, the sand bore his story. Deep, hurried footprints trailing toward the waterline. My hands moved before my mind did, finding the small shovel leaning against the porch. The sky was pale gray, the kind of morning that hides secrets instead of revealing them. I followed the trail down to the shore. Each step made the sand sink beneath my weight, swallowing sound. When I reached the spot where his prints ended, I saw it, a patch of disturbed sand, darker, uneven. My heart twisted. He had been digging again. I dropped to my knees, pressing the shovel into the ground. The wet sand gave way too easily, like something that wanted to be found. Each thrust felt heavier, my arms trembling. And then, with a dull thud, the blade struck wood. For a long moment, I just stared at it. A small, rotted box, edges warped from years of salt water and neglect. My throat closed. I brushed the sand away with shaking fingers and pried it open. Inside lay a tangle of objects, a woman's silver bracelet, a floral scarf stiff with dried salt, a rusted locket, and a phone, half buried, half decayed, screen cracked but still faintly glowing. I pressed the power button with trembling fingers. The screen flickered to life, faint and ghostly. The background image appeared, Amir, smiling beside the woman from the photograph. Her hair whipped across his face, her hand on his chest, both of them standing exactly where I knelt now. For a heartbeat, the world fell away. The sea hissed closer, as if reclaiming what it had once taken. I clutched the phone, bile rising in my throat. "Who were you?" I whispered to the dead woman in pixels, and then from somewhere behind me, faint but unmistakable, I heard the crunch of footsteps in wet sand. I turned, heart pounding. Someone else was on the beach. Back inside the house, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The phone was cold, heavier than it should have been, like it remembered everything it had seen. I wiped the sand off and connected it to my charger, the faint glow of its screen cutting through the gloom of the room. For a moment, nothing happened. Then with a stuttering hum, the device came to life, unlocking without a password, as if it wanted to be heard. My reflection stared back at me from the cracked glass, fractured into pieces. The messages loaded slowly, each one a wound reopening. "You promised me you'd come back. I'm scared. Please don't leave me here. The tide's coming in." The timestamps were old, months before our trip, but the desperation in her words felt fresh, still wet with panic. My stomach churned as I scrolled higher, finding his name above hers. Amir. His replies were clipped, transactional. "Stay calm. I'll handle it. Don't text again." Each message was a blade cutting through the illusions I'd clung to. My husband hadn't just been here before. He had left someone behind. A choked sob escaped before I could stop it. I pressed a hand to my mouth, trembling. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters like impatient fingers. The sound of a car door slammed in the distance. His car. Panic surged through me. I yanked the charger from the socket and shoved the phone into the drawer, covering it with old linens. My pulse thundered in my ears. Amir stepped in moments later, dripping from the mist, his expression unreadable. "You look pale," he said softly, brushing my cheek. "Bad dreams again?" I nodded, forcing a small, shaky smile. "Just tired." He leaned close, his voice a whisper against my ear. "You'll feel better soon. This place has a way of cleansing things." I swallowed the scream rising in my throat and managed a fragile, "Maybe you're right." As he walked away, humming faintly, I stared at the drawer, the phone hidden beneath the sheets, and thought, the sea might cleanse, but it also returns what we bury. The door creaked open just as twilight surrendered to night. Amir stood there, soaked to the bone, shirt clinging to his skin, eyes wild with something that wasn't confusion. He swayed slightly in the doorway, the smell of salt water and rain clinging to him like guilt. "I got lost," he said. His voice was hoarse, uneven. The fog came in fast, but his shoes were caked with sand, wet, dark sand, and there were no footprints leading to the car, only to the beach. I watched the tremor in his hand as he ran it through his hair. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I forced a soft laugh, pretending to believe him. "You should change before you catch cold." He nodded absently, moving past me, water dripping onto the floorboards. I noticed the scratches along his wrist, raw, red lines that hadn't been there before. When I reached for his arm, he pulled away too quickly. At dinner, silence was its own language. His fork clinked against the plate in measured rhythm, like he was counting something in his head. I wanted to ask, "What did you dig up this time?" but instead I said, "You're quiet." He smiled thinly. "Just tired. The sea takes it out of you." Later, after he'd gone to bed, I lay beside him, eyes open in the dark. His breathing was slow but uneven, like someone dreaming of falling. Then hours later I heard it. The faint scrape of metal against earth carried through the open window. I slipped from the bed, careful not to make the floorboards groan. Through the curtain I saw his shadow on the beach, shovel in hand, the moonlight silvering his movements. He was digging again, not far from where I'd found the box. Each thrust of the shovel was frantic, desperate. He wasn't burying this time. He was searching. My chest tightened. He knew. He must have gone back, seen the disturbed sand, realized I'd touched his secret. When he finally stopped, he stood motionless for a long time, staring toward the house. I ducked behind the curtain just before his gaze lifted. Lying back in bed, I could still hear the shovels echo in my head, like a heartbeat beneath the floorboards. He knows I know. Dawn bled slowly into the horizon, turning the sea into a restless shimmer of gray and gold. I walked barefoot across the cold sand, each step sinking, each breath sharp with salt. He was already there, standing by the rocks, motionless, as if waiting for the tide to decide what to do with him. When he turned, his face looked older, hollowed by something that had finally surfaced. "You shouldn't have gone through my things," he said quietly. I stopped a few feet away. "You shouldn't have buried her." The wind tore at my words, but he heard them. His jaw tightened, and for a moment I saw the truth flicker in his eyes, grief and guilt braided together. "You don't understand," he said. "It wasn't like that." "Then tell me," my voice shook. "Tell me why her things were buried in that box, why her face was scratched out." He ran a hand over his mouth, eyes glistening with exhaustion. "She wouldn't let go," he said finally. "She followed me here, threatened to ruin everything. I just wanted it to stop. I didn't mean to." He cut himself off like the words had teeth. The waves surged higher, licking the rocks where we stood. "You killed her," I whispered. He took a step closer. "No," he said, desperation rising. "You have to believe me. It was an accident." "She fell, like you got lost?" I spat, the air cracked between us. He grabbed my arm, not violently, but hard enough that I felt the tremor in his hand. "Please," he said. "You have to let it go. We can start over. That's why I brought you here." Something inside me snapped. I tore free, stumbling backward on the slick stones. "Start over?" I said, breath catching. "With ghosts buried under our feet?" His face twisted. Anger, sorrow, fear, all bleeding together. And then, as the surf roared, his foot slipped on the wet rock. He reached for me. I don't remember if I caught him, or if I let him fall. The scream that followed was swallowed whole by the sea, carried off into the wind until only the crashing of waves remained. When I opened my eyes, the sky was pale and merciless. Waves whispered beside me, retreating like they had seen too much. My clothes clung heavy with salt water. My head throbbed with every heartbeat. The air smelled of rust and seaweed, and something faintly metallic beneath it all. There was no sign of Amir, just the restless ocean, dragging and returning, as if testing whether to give him back. I stumbled to my feet, calling his name once, twice, before realizing how hollow it sounded against the wind. The rocks were slick with sea foam. The spot where we'd stood last night was smeared with disturbed sand and a dark stain that the tide had begun to erase. By the time I reached the house, my hands were shaking too much to dial. The police came before noon. 2 officers, boots muddy, expressions careful. I told them everything. How he'd walked out into the storm, how I'd found him at dawn, how he'd slipped. "Accidents happen near the rocks," one of them said, scribbling notes. "The tide's deceptive this time of year." I nodded. My voice was steady, practiced. "He lost his footing. They searched the shoreline, their shouts swallowed by the wind." I sat on the porch steps, wrapped in a blanket one of them had handed me. The fabric was warm, but I couldn't stop shaking. A young officer crouched near me. "Are you sure that's what happened?" he asked gently. I looked out toward the sea. The horizon shimmered, clean and indifferent. "Yes," I said. He slipped, but inside my skull the memory replayed differently. The grasp of his hand, the pull of gravity, the scream torn between air and water, and the silence that followed, my silence. As the officers drove away, I stood alone before the sea, watching it breathe in slow, endless rhythm. Somewhere beneath that surface, truth slept, waited, hidden, waiting for the tide to change again. I whispered into the wind. He promised me peace by the sea. The sea answered only with the sound of waves breaking, as if laughing, softly, 3 days after they declared the search suspended. The sea changed its mind. I woke to the sound of voices, distant, urgent, carried through the mist that hugged the coastline. When I stepped outside, barefoot, the morning was pale and heavy, the kind of gray that makes everything look washed clean but hollow. Down by the tide line, a small crowd had gathered. That's where they found him. The waves had been kind enough to return what they borrowed, but not kind in how they delivered him back. His body lay half buried, tangled in seaweed, the skin swollen and pale. I felt the world narrow, like I was watching through a glass window that someone else's breath had fogged. Detective Samira Rauf stood beside the coroner, her hands in her pockets, eyes sharp behind the calmness of her face. She didn't look at me at first, only at him. Then when she finally did, her gaze didn't accuse. It dissected, quietly, methodically. "You said he slipped," she murmured, voice soft enough for only me to hear. "Yes," I replied. The rocks were wet. Her pen hovered above her notebook, motionless. "And you were with him?" I hesitated. We argued. He went down to the water alone, a pause. And you followed? The tide rolled in, slow and deliberate. Foam lapped at the hem of my jeans. I don't remember, I whispered, though memory burned bright behind my eyes. The struggle, the scream, the cold silence that followed. Samira studied me for another long moment, then nodded, signaling to her team. Grief does strange things, she said gently. Sometimes the mind fills in what it can't accept. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, a seagull cried overhead, sharp, echoing. The crowd dispersed. The sand swallowed their footprints. Only mine remained, leading both to and away from the body. Later, sitting alone in the same porch chair where I'd waited for him days before, I stared at the ocean's horizon. It looked endless, and yet I knew it kept count. The waves dragged secrets deeper than any grave. I pressed the recording button on my phone and whispered, almost to myself, "He promised me peace by the sea." I suppose he kept his promise, just not the way I imagined. The screen dimmed. The surf whispered its endless rhythm. Somewhere beneath, truth rested, unspoken, preserved by salt and silence. And as the last light faded, the tide rose again, erasing the edges of everything it touched.